Who is the King of the Jews? God's people have been asking this question for centuries as they've waited for their long anointed king. Throughout the Old Testament, God promised to send not only a king to rule over his people, his nation, but over all nations. We see in Genesis 49, Jacob calls his sons to come around him before his death, and he blesses them. But in this, his prophetic blessing creates the expectation that a king from Israel will rule a worldwide kingdom one day. We see in Deuteronomy 17, God gives a profile of the person who should be the king amongst his people. It says a king who would become one that is anointed by God, belongs to God's people, is faithful, is loyal, obedient to God and his word, ruling with justice and righteousness, but also ready to sacrifice for God's people. This promise is repeated and expanded in Balaam's final prophecy we see in Numbers 24. Then we see Moses and Joshua lead God's people into the promised land, but neither of them become kings. Various judges like Samson and Gideon save their people from other nations, but never become kings. Living by faith in God's frustrated Israel, and these appointed prophets and judges were not enough in their eyes. And for this reason, we see in 1 Samuel 8 that they would ask God for a king to lead them like the other nations around them. And eventually, Israel would get their king. He would establish a monarchy under the name of David. In 1 Chronicles 17, God makes a covenant with David, promising this anointed king. But is David the fulfillment of this promise that we see throughout Genesis and Deuteronomy and Numbers? David is a mighty king, but this king God spoke of would come out of his line, his family. And he would not only be the son of David, but he would also be the son of God. And he would rule over not just an earthly kingdom, but an eternal one. And we see 1,000 years later, God's people again will continue to ask the question, who is the King of the Jews? And this time, God's people have their long-awaited, anointed king who have been promised for centuries standing right before them. As we'll see in our passage this morning, Jesus, this anointed king, endured mocking and beatings because God's people chose not to accept him but reject him. If you have your Bibles, and I hope you do, turn with me to John chapter 19. John chapter 19, I'll be reading from the CSB translation. And as you're turning there, we saw last week in John 18, we answered this question. Isaac said it this morning. What do we do when we encounter truth? God's people and Pilate, this Roman governor, they faced a choice. They could have listened to Jesus and sought the truth, but instead they chose power and control over truth. But the question we need to ask and answer this morning is, what do we do when we encounter King Jesus? This passage challenges us to consider who we say Jesus is and how we respond to this very king. And Jesus is going to show us this morning in our passage 4 aspects of his kingship. First, we're going to see the suffering of King Jesus. Look with me starting in verse 1. God's word says, "Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged." So if you were with us last week, we saw at the end of chapter 18, Pilate presents Jesus to this crowd. And there's 2 men standing there. There's Jesus, the innocent man, and there's Barabbas, the criminal, the one that physically was trying to overthrow Rome and what the people wanted, compared to Jesus, who was there to actually die for these people and for their sins, but they chose to reject him. And now Pilate sends Jesus to get his punishment, flogging. And this was a brutal Roman punishment, where they would tie their victims to a pole and beat them with a whip. And at the end of this whip, there was bones and sharp objects and stones. And whoever had the whip in their hand to hit the victim, this criminal, would lay into their back, let these sharp objects dig into them, and then drag everything that they had off of them. One commentator said of flogging, it tore a man's back into stripes. Few remained conscious through this horrible ordeal. Some died, and many went mad. But in case of the crucifixion, flogging was used to weaken the victim. So when they were put up on the cross it would weaken them and hopefully they would die very soon. But this also satisfied God's sovereign plan as spoken through the prophet Isaiah. We'll see several of these passages this morning. They'll be up on the screen. Isaiah 53 verse 5 says, "But he was pierced because of our rebellion, crushed because of our iniquities, punished with our peace was in him, and we are healed by his wounds." And now we're going to see these same Roman soldiers that we saw a few chapters ago that were knocked to the ground because of Jesus saying who he was, now get their payback at the King of the Jews. Look at verse 2. "The soldiers also twisted together a crown of thorns, put it on his head, and clothed him in a purple robe. And they kept coming up to him, saying, 'Hail, King of the Jews,' and were slapping his face." Kings of this day, or even up to our monarchies that we see now, are known for many things, but there's two specific things that would have stood out to them: their crown and their robe. If Jesus was indeed a king, these soldiers would do everything they can, even mockingly, to get this king the garments that he needed. First, they made a crown out of thorns for this King of the Jews. So you can imagine in this area, we've seen vines, but there's also different bushes of various types of thorns. And the thorns that were to be used are also now called Christ thorns. They're about 2 to 3 inches long. You'll see a kind of an image of it up on the screen. But you have to imagine these soldiers, it says placed, probably shoving this crown on his head, cutting into his head after the beating he just took. But this crown symbolized much more than just a king. It would symbolize these people and what Jesus came to do, the curse of sin. All the way back in Genesis 3, after the fall, we see Jesus now, the one that was talked about even there, came to bore the sins of the world on our behalf. And we see throughout the Old Testament, God uses this idea of thorns and thistles with his people, reminding us of this sin and the curse that was to follow after it. The second, we see this purple robe. This is the royal colors. The Emperor Caesar would wear these purple type of robes as he was out and about. But unlike King Caesar, who they would salute, these soldiers decide to slap King Jesus in the face. Everything about this was intended to mock and humiliate Jesus. But even in the mockery, this symbolism points to Christ as king, and his suffering crowned him as the true king of redemption. How do we respond to Jesus' suffering? We took communion together as a church. We remembered his broken body and the blood that was shed for us. But when we hear this story, do we take it for granted? Or does it inspire us to worship and being obedient to him? And I think in this time, even as I was praying, thinking about Thanksgiving and this Christmas season and these remembrances and family and all these things, it is so easy us in every single day in the day-to-day lives that we live that we can forget these kind of things that draw us back to who Jesus is and what he has done for us. We see the suffering of King Jesus, but we also see his innocence as a king. Look at verse 4. "Pilate went outside again and said to them, 'Look, I'm bringing him out to let you know I find no grounds for charging him.' Then Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, 'Here is the man.'" So Pilate comes out to this crowd and repeats what he said in John 18. There's nothing to charge Jesus with. He's an innocent man. He has nothing else to say. But presenting this king of the Jews, these people's king, to them, many scholars believe Pilate was hoping that this punishment that he's already went through would satisfy the crowd, that they wouldn't have to go all the way through with the crucifixion. And Pilate's essentially saying, here is this man, he's beaten, he's bloodied, there's sweat and spit all over his body. What is he going to do? He's no threat. Then we see Pilate get his answer in verse 6. "When the chief priests and the temple servants saw him, they shouted, 'Crucify, crucify.' Pilate responded, 'Take him and crucify him yourself, since I find no grounds for charging him.'" We aren't told what the crowd responds with. We are told what the religious leaders respond with. These devout Jews who have prayed their whole lives to see the Messiah, to see this anointed king, respond by wanting this man to be crucified. This rejection of Jesus fulfills prophecy once again. Earlier in Isaiah 53, verse 3, it says, "He was despised and rejected by men, a man of suffering who knew what sickness was. He was like someone people turned away from. He was despised, and we didn't value him." What a word for these people. They cry for crucifixion, and it reflects humanity's rejection of God's authority. But more importantly, their acceptance of sin. This crown of thorns, the robe, and even Jesus' humility also continues to point to the true identity of who this anointed king is, Jesus Christ. And then for the third time, we see Pilate pronounces Jesus is innocent of every single charge. There is nothing against him. He wants nothing to do with this. And I think direct application for us this morning is Pilate recognizes that Jesus is innocent, but he fails to act on the conviction that he has. And for some of us today, that is us. Are we compromising our faith to please others, trying to evade responsibility for responding to Jesus? It could be the smallest of things in life, it could be the biggest of things, but are we doing that this morning? We see King Jesus suffer, that he's innocent. As we see in verse 7, we see his identity. Verse 7 says, "We have a law," the Jews replied to him, "and according to that law, he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard this statement, he was more afraid than ever. As you read through this quickly, you may miss the importance of this phrase that the Jewish leaders said. Even in Pilate's comment that they should crucify Jesus themselves, they know that they cannot do it. We've talked about that the past few weeks. They need the Roman ruler to approve of this, to be the one that pushes it through. So now we see the Jews change their kind of motives, their tactics of how they're going to get to Jesus. They go from a politically driven motive to now they go to a spiritual one. And this makes Pilate the one who is in control, the one that has the ability to earthly judge people right in front of him. We see in the text, what does it say? He was more afraid than ever. So why would this guy that has all the power be more afraid now? Because of these words that they said. We know Pilate didn't want to see any religious riots from the crowds, but he also knew that part of his job was to uphold many of the traditions and the laws that were being had with some of the places that they conquered. See, when the Romans would come in and take over various lands, their goal was to not only conquer these areas, but they wanted to win the people. So these local people that had these traditions, they wanted to uphold them as much as they can, as long as they don't get in the way of Caesar. And this tactic by the Jewish leaders was great. It was perfect. They tried one thing, it didn't work. Now they switch hands and go back to the religious argument. It would help them get what they wanted, but it also confirmed what Pilate began to think about Jesus. And right around this time, we read in the Gospel of Matthew that Pilate's wife says to him, it says, while Pilate was sitting on the judge's bench, his wife sent word to him, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man," talking about Jesus. "For today I've suffered terribly in a dream because of him." So something was up. This man was different. They can't put their finger on it. They don't know how to go about this. Pilate was afraid of what his decision might lead to. And we see him flustered. Look at verse 9. Pilate went back into the headquarters and asked Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus did not give an answer. So Pilate said to him, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Don't you know that I have the authority to release you and the authority to crucify you?" We see Pilate come back into Jesus and asking, "Where are you from?" It's kind of like when you go on an airplane and you're standing in line and you have your ticket and you know exactly your seat number and where you're going, and then you look at it 75 times because you're scared to death that you might get it wrong, and you keep asking the same question over and over, even though you know the answer. Jesus already said where he is from, but Jesus gives him no answer. And as Pilate's rumbling through trying to figure out what to say, what to do, another prophecy is fulfilled. Isaiah 53 verse 7 says, "He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb led to the slaughter and like a sheep silent before her shears, he did not open his mouth." prophecy after prophecy after prophecy being accomplished in and through Jesus. But Pilate doesn't like this answer, the lack of one through Jesus. So then we see him just spout off. In verse 10, he says, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Don't you know that I have the authority to release you and the authority to crucify you?" When my family and I lived in Florida while I was coaching at FAU, we used to take free family excursions all the time going up A1A and looking at all the ginormous houses on A1A right outside of Boca Raton. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of Boca, have ever been there. How many people have been to Boca before? Okay, so several people, okay. And I jokingly say this. We moved to Carmel after Boca, and we know Carmel. I know it's okay in here. But it makes Carmel look like a Pittsburgh or Claremont. That's nothing against those places, but it's a different world. It's a completely different world. But I say that because you drive by these houses on A1A, right off the beach, and you see them and you think, okay, these people make a lot of money. You think it might be a celebrity. You might think it's some different sports, if it was Miami Heat, different people in the area, but it wasn't them. It was the owners of these teams. It was the CEOs of Fortune 100 companies. It was the people that wrote the checks of the really rich people. The ones that had all the power to change and dictate everything lived there. But these are the type of people that rarely had their authority questioned. And Pilate is used to this very thing. He cannot believe that Jesus is not even saying anything to even fight for his life. But he also couldn't believe that Jesus didn't see the power that he had as a Roman authority, as a governor. And yet the King of Jews responds the only way he should. Look at verse 11. "You would have no authority over me at all," Jesus answered him, "if it had not been given you from above. This is why the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin." One commentator said, Rome had the power, but in reality, God held the power. Jesus understood that Pilate had power, but we've seen throughout the Gospel of John, God had granted the ultimate authority to his Son, this King of the Jews. And whatever authority that you've been given here on earth, this is a prime example of it. If you're leading people at your job, you're coaching a team, you're leading your family at home, it does not matter. Ultimately, the authority that you have been gifted with, it is truly a gift, has been given from above, from God. The question is whether an individual chooses to wield that authority for his kingdom and for its purposes or not, because it will have serious consequences one day. We will all be accountable for this authority that we have been given. And while the human in charge may be the boss, they're truly not the boss. With Pilate, Jesus can see that he recognizes his innocence, but knows that he is misusing his authority and he's avoiding the truth. And that is sin. And this underscores, again, God's sovereignty in using human sin and rebellion for his glory, for his purposes. What's even worse is that the Jews are also guilty. These people that knew the scriptures. It says the greater sin that we see in verse 11, this is Judas and these religious officials. They knew what they were doing. They were actively seeking to kill their anointed king. The great philosopher Uncle Ben from the Spider-Man movies once said, "With great power comes great responsibility." Pilate and these religious officials had great power, but also came with the responsibility to act on this power, and why Jesus judged them ever so harshly. The question for us this morning is, how do we respond to Jesus' authority? If he is the king of your life, what do you do? Do you, like Pilate, try to sidestep his lordship? Or do you submit to him as king? If we were to put your actions from this past week up on the projector, would it reflect that? Which is a very convicting thing for even me to say. But could you say with an honest face that he is the king of your life and you follow him in that way and you obey him in that way? Jesus' kingship is on display. We see the suffering, we see the innocence, we see his true identity, but ultimately we will see his condemnation as king. Look at verse 12. From that moment, Pilate kept trying to release him. For Pilate, desperation has set in, and now he's trying to do everything he can to get out of the situation. He knows that this innocent man is unlike any prisoner that has ever stood before him. He should be set free. He feels the full force, though, of this crowd and these leaders screaming at him to have Jesus crucified. Yet he could not get himself to do it until we see the Jews shout this. Look at verse 12. If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Anyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. How many people in this room love euchre? Raise your hand. Okay, this is like an Indiana staple. So I will say my wife does not know how to play euchre, so if anyone's trying to train, I would love to be able to teach her. But if you've never played euchre before, it's a card game. There's 2 teams, okay? So 4 players. You use 9 through ace. You use all the suits of the deck. And essentially, you go through different hands or tricks, and one team gets the choice of the trump suit. So there's one color, one diamonds, hearts, whatever it is, that can beat any other card. The jack of hearts would be up on the screen. That would be the actual trump, and then it goes down from there. And we see these Jewish leaders, like any good euchre player, save that jack of hearts for the very end. They're poking and prodding, they're using, they're messing around, and then finally, they know exactly what to say to get right at Pilate. All the Roman governors, including Pilate, feared the emperor. And the Jews knew this very well. But specifically, Pilate would want to be Caesar's friend. This would be a title for these governors. He would want to be a friend. Caesar really didn't care about half of them, so it didn't matter. But to be a friend would be very important for Pilate. Because many scholars believe that Pilate was married to his granddaughter. Family complicates things. But this emperor at the time was legit paranoid and would kill anybody around him or in his family if he thought treason was up. And regardless of being a trusted friend or a family member, he would go after people. And this trump card that the Jewish leaders played was the very thing that pushed Pilate over the line. It made him going from afraid to what to do to be active, and now is going to set the tone. Verse 13. When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus outside. He sat down in the judge's seat in a place called the Stone Pavement, but in Aramaic, Gabbatha. Pilate went out to this elevated platform where the courts would be, right in front of all these crowds, and as an earthly judge would present Jesus, this eternal judge. And then we see our author, the Apostle John, give some context in verse 14. It was the preparation day for the Passover, so this would have been Friday, so Good Friday, and it was about noon. Then he told the Jews, "Here is your king." They shouted, take him away, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Should I crucify your king?" And listen to what they say. "We have no king but Caesar." The chief priests answered. Then he handed him over to be crucified. Then they took Jesus away. We see 2 responses to who Jesus is, this King of the Jews. Number 1, we see confused, afraid, and now threatened by the word, possibly heading even to Rome about the King of the Jews, Pilate gives in. But also we see God's people choose their king. They make a choice. Not the king that's described in the scriptures that they knew so well. The description that I mentioned in Deuteronomy, this anointed king who belongs to God's people, that was Jesus, who was faithful, loyal, obedient to God and his word, ruling with justice and righteousness. Even these kings that were called were to handwrite the law out completely. And Jesus is the one that wrote the law, but also ready to sacrifice for God's people. But by saying these words, "We have no king but Caesar," these Jewish leaders ultimately betray their nation's beliefs and they reject God. And as we close and the band comes up, this passage shows us Jesus, this long-awaited anointed king who willingly submits to suffering and rejection to fulfill God's redemptive plan. However, this passage shows us something else. It shows us rejecting Jesus leads to spiritual blindness and allegiance to false kings. I heard one pastor say, when you're choosing a king, one who will destroy us versus the one who loves us enough to be destroyed on our behalf. We saw what Pilate and these Jewish leaders chose. The question is today, what will you do when you encounter King Jesus? Or you could ask it in this way, how will you respond to the king who suffered, was rejected, and died to save you? That might be a decision that you've never made, or it might be a decision that you're going to have to make every single day in and through your actions. And I will tell you, our lives will change when we comprehend who Jesus is and commit ourselves to Jesus being the king. Not just the one that died for our sins, but the one that is currently ruling. We'll see the world different, and I will say personally, as a church planner, you will see God's mission completely different. Friends, acknowledge Jesus is the king of your life. Trust in his sovereignty and obey his word. That's what we're called to do. And as we continue to live reliant on Jesus every day, let our prayer be, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it's in heaven.